Pursuant to the order of reference of May 16, 2022, the committee is meeting on its study of the Canada People's Republic of China relations with a focus on the Canada-Taiwan relations. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom applications. At this point, we'll welcome some of our guests today. Mr. Genis, good to see you. Ms. Sgro, good to have you here. I'm a little intimidated because Judy was the first chair that, handled a committee that I was on when I first got here in 2015, and so there you go. And Samir, good to see you. And Talib Nur Mohammed is lurking there. Oh yes, there he is, at the bottom of the screen. So good to have you on board. Now, a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, of course, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Now, especially for the benefit of Mr. Bergeron, we want to make sure that everybody has had their tests. The audio was good when we checked it, but we've had examples in the not too recent past of things that checked out well at one part of the day, and then by the time we got into committee, it wasn't so good. So it's always going to be kind of on an edge. We'll see how we do. So with that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. As individuals, Dr. Tom Lam, Associate Professor, University of Toronto, and Colin Robertson, Senior Advisor and Fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So gentlemen, welcome to the Canada-China Committee. Mr. Lam, you have 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, the Special Committee. It's an honor for me to be here this evening. What we call Taiwan today is a product of a long history. For centuries, the island exists at the edge of successive dynastic empires until it was colonized by the Empire of Japan in the last decade of the 19th century. After the end of World War II, when the communists defeated the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. In order to maintain its rule as an outsider, the nationalists began a period of martial law for nearly 4 decades. By the late 1980s, due to domestic and international pressures, Taiwan began a series of democratic reforms, and the first direct presidential election took place in 1996. Since then, Taiwan has experienced multiple changes of government through democratic election with a high level of public participation, and this happens at every level of the government. In other words, in spite of the 4 decades of martial law under the nationalist government until 1987, the nationalists that once being regarded as the foreign occupier has remade itself and is now considered as a legitimate Taiwanese political party by the public. Taiwanese elections have been so lively that until recently, presidential elections were a tourist attraction for many mainland Chinese, to the point that there had been a small industry of election tourism. And of course, Taiwan has been also a major destination for Chinese-speaking political activists in exile. It is perhaps fair to say that the peace and economic prosperity in the past few decades has been grounded on the One China framework, or more precisely, the different interpretation of that framework that has been generally agreed upon by the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, along with the international community, including Canada, even though the international community too have their own interpretations of the idea of One China. In the past few decades, however, mainland China has become a rather different pace. Among other things, it has become a new superpower that is integrated in the global economy. It's also important to point out that the Chinese government's foreign policy, at least partially, is driven by what they have come to call the century of humiliations, which refers to the period of the First Opium War in the middle of the 19th century until the founding of the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party in 1949. This was a period when the previous dynastic empires and later the Chinese Republic was subjugated to and invaded by foreign powers. In this narrative, the separation of Taiwan from China is seen as a humiliation and a problem that needs to be corrected. Whether we share this particular historical narrative or not, it is vital to recognize the powerful emotion behind China's current claims of Taiwan. Meanwhile, Taiwan too has become a very different place in the past few decades. Democratization has led many Taiwanese to reflect on their own past, including the experience of Japanese colonialism, the military rules under the nationalists. For many Taiwanese, especially the younger generations, the accumulation of those experiences, however traumatic, have turned themselves into a different people. Taiwan today has a vibrant civil society that cherishes progressive values. For instance, LGBTQ rights in Taiwan are often being seen as the most progressive in Asia. And like Canada, same-sex marriage has always been legalized. Also, Taiwan embraces ethnic and linguistic diversity and has also begun to address or pay attention to the welfare of the indigenous population with its own program of truth and reconciliation. Similarly, the Taiwanese government and the public generally have a strong ecological awareness, since Taiwan's early democratic movement was linked to its environmental activism. To make the long story short, the changing political and economic landscape on both sides of the Taiwan Strait in the past few decades has eroded the foundation of the fragile peace and stability that we have all benefited from, as the two sides seem to be moving away from one another. But that doesn't mean the war is inevitable. Most people in Taiwan, regardless of the politics, would like to see the continuation of the status quo, and Canada could help to preserve the status quo by strengthening its ties with Taiwan, particularly at the civil society level. So to sum up, whether it's colonialism, empire, typhoons, or earthquake, or the public health crisis, the Taiwanese peoples are always aware of their own precarity. So far, they have not just survived it, but they have also prospered. And I hope there will be space for them to continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. We'll now go to Mr. Robertson for 5 minutes or less.
Chair, thank you. I made my first visit to Taiwan in the spring of 1988, 6 months after being posted as consul to the British Crown colony of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was China's entrepot to the world and our best entree into the rest of Asia. It was also home to an expatriate population of Canadians that after the Tiananmen Square massacre, when Hong Kongers flocked to Canada, is now the largest in Asia. I was also credited to China. Every 4 months, I would travel north by rail to Guangzhou to attend to our consular cases while reporting on the economic developments in China. I watched the transformation of Shenzhen from bucolic rice paddies and water buffaloes to a booming frontier town of bamboo scaffolding and raucous growth. Today, Shenzhen is China's Silicon Valley, home to its tech champion, Huawei. I had already visited Beijing in the coal smoke with the hutongs and bicycles. My visit to Taipei reminded me very much of Beijing. The people were ethnically the same, Han Chinese, but they had backed the wrong side in the Civil War. The Republic of China's Kuomintang Party and the People's Republic of China's Chinese Communist Party ruled in much the same autocratic fashion. For the West, the iconic Asian leader of the time was Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew. Lee argued that the Asian way, or at least the Chinese way, was a benevolent but autocratic government that accorded no priority to human rights. It seemed a fair assessment. Fast forward to 2019, when I returned to Taiwan. Months earlier, I had visited Shanghai and Beijing, now modern and bustling cities. Taipei had kept pace, but there was one fundamental difference. As we drove into the city, we passed Taipei's White House, the home of President Madam Tsai Ing-wen. There was a demonstration. What was it about, I asked. It was in support of freedom of the press. An oligarch with ties to China wanted to buy a local newspaper, something the public opposed. For them, it was a part of the long-running PRC disinformation and cyber campaign designed to disrupt Taiwanese democracy. Taiwan has become a vibrant and lively democracy with peaceful transitions between parties, a free press, independent judiciary, a competent and arguably the most uncorrupt civil service in Asia. In its annual assessment, Political Rights and Civil Liberties, Freedom House scores Taiwan with 94 out of 100. Canada scores 98, the US gets 83, China gets 9. I had dinner with their Digital Affairs Minister, Audrey Tang. Tang is transgender. Taiwan was one of the first Asian nations to recognize LGBTQ rights. Applied technology, notably semiconductors, Tang began, is the means by which Taiwan leapt into the ranks of developed nations. Yes, she told me, China is relentless in its campaign to destabilize and intimidate the Taiwanese through disinformation, cyber warfare, and intrusions into its airspace. But the Taiwanese people will defend their democracy. They rely on the US and wish that we in the West were less cowed by China. I'll conclude with an observation and 3 recommendations. My observation, Taiwan belies the Chinese Communist Party belief that the Chinese and Asian people prefer and do best under autocracy. In that sense, Taiwan undermines the foundational belief and thus the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. For Xi Jinping, Taiwan is the heretic state. Xi is determined to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, by force if necessary. Vladimir Putin feels the same about Ukraine. As to recommendations, first, now that the CCP has snuffed out the liberties guaranteed by the UN sanctioned agreements to grow representative government in Hong Kong, Taiwan is the best place in the Indo-Pacific to monitor the mainland Taiwan's think tanks and intelligence about China are without peer. With China a hotbed for pandemics, but inclined to cover up, Taiwan's proximity gives us early warning. Second, we should do more to support Taiwan through trade and investment and people-to-people ties. Let's market Canadian schools and universities and promote Canada as the destination for tourism and immigration. This committee should officially visit Taiwan. We need to resume ministerial visits based on shared interest like trade, innovation, health, and regional security. The last minister to visit was then Industry Minister John Manley in 1998. We should also support Taiwan's legitimate aspirations to join institutions like the CPTPP, World Health Organization, and the Montreal-based ICAO. Third, China is actively challenging our rules-based order, and as we know, overtly attempting to disrupt democratic governments. I applaud the committee's discussion of Chinese disinformation and cyber intrusions, including intellectual property theft and attacks on critical infrastructure. But what about allegations of money laundering, secret police, co-opting officials, and campaign funding for parliamentary candidates? We must stay engaged with the People's Republic of China for reasons of geopolitics, climate change, pandemics, and nuclear proliferation, as well as trade and our people-to-people ties. But we must re-examine our policy on Chinese state-owned enterprises, and we need to add teeth, sanctions, to the declaration on arbitrary detention to deter further Chinese hostage-taking. Thank you, Chair.
And thank you, Mr. Robertson. We'll now go to our first round of questioning, and for 6 minutes, Mr. Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, Dr. Lam and Mr. Robertson, for coming to appear in front of us today. I'd like to ask some questions of Mr. Robertson. My first question is, you have experience in Washington. You have experience in the Canada-U.S. relationship, and many people believe that Beijing will invade Taiwan in the next 3 to 4 years. And so my first question is, if that happens, what will Washington's response be, and how will that impact Canada? In other words, will Washington's response be kinetic or non-kinetic? Will it be military, non-military, blockades, sanctions? What do you think Washington will do if Beijing invades Taiwan?
Well, sir, I think that there's certainly great concern that it will happen. So I think what you're going to see, and it's already started, the effort to, what they sort of say, turn Taiwan into a porcupine, provide it with enough capacity that for the Chinese to invade would be very expensive. And I think that there is a rethinking within Taiwan about some of the weaponry that they need to ensure that what we call porcupine capacity. Much of that capacity, of course, will come from the United States, but the Taiwanese have already begun things like construction of their new submarines, for example, and anti-ballistic missile defense. So I think that will be what they will do in the belief that the best, just as like we in NATO feel the best deterrence to Russian aggression is a strong defensive capacity that will force the Russians, in the case of NATO, to think twice before going into a NATO country. So the same would apply to Taiwan. If the worst should happen, then there is considerable division, sir, as you probably know, within American thinking group circles about how the United States will respond and its capacity to respond. Much, of course, would depend on what the Chinese did and whether they were taking out some of the American bases in Guam and Okinawa, for example. But you can be sure the United States will have some form of response, kinetic, but I think cyber is increasingly going to enter into the equation. So I can't offer you, you hope it doesn't get there, but I think the best approach now is to help Taiwan create sufficient deterrent power so that Chinese generals think twice and advise Xi Jinping that this is going to be extremely difficult and costly. I think the Americans' signals, and I'm quite confident that President Biden said this to Xi Jinping yesterday, was that if they were to proceed, there would be a response from the United States that would do great harm to China.
And what should Canada be doing to prepare for any eventualities?
Well, our first concern always, sir, is our citizens, and we've got a good team in Taiwan. There are a number of Canadians there. There are those with links to Canada as a consequence of student ties and immigration. So the first thing is to make plans for the worst case, which I think is something we should be doing. But at the same time, we should also be helping as best we can to make it a contribution, if we are in a position to do so, to deter China from wanting to go into Taiwan. And that, of course, I think means more frequent visits by our frigates, probably as part of with Australia, the United States, because my great fear is that the Chinese will decide to do something just as they did with Two Michaels, to make an example of an ally of the United States. But I think that freedom of navigation, the Taiwan states, we've been sending our frigates through on a regular basis, sometimes with the United States, sometimes with other allied partners. I think that's important, so that the Chinese get the impression, I think the impression we want to leave, which is correct, is it is not just the United States dealing with, it's other countries like Canada that have an interest in continuing the current situation in Taiwan.
In addition to sending a frigate through the Taiwan Strait in concert with allies, what other things can Canada be doing in addition to ministerial visits, in addition to tightening trade and investment ties, what other things should Canada be doing to deter Beijing's aggression against the island?
Well, I think we're going to see an Indo-Pacific strategy, I hope, in the coming weeks. It's been promised for some time. And I hope that there is a component in there which includes significant reinvestment in our deterrent capacity, particularly as it relates to our military, because I do think that's what counts. It's what the Australians are doing. It's what some of our allies are doing. I think it's what we should be doing. Well, at the same time, of course, we're good on the diplomatic side, making those representations through our representation in Beijing and in the dealings that, for example, that Minister Jolie had with her Chinese counterpart yesterday.
Okay, and just very quickly, what can Canada and Canadian businesses be doing to harden themselves against a potential invasion by Beijing of Taiwan in the event that happens? What are sort of the economic measures we should be putting in place to ensure that we're not completely sideswiped by a potential invasion?
A brief answer, if you could, please, Mr. Robertson.
Sure, very brief. It all comes down to cyber, and I think just as our banks are hardening themselves and our governments have appreciated intrusions, so should broader business as well that does any kind of business. Our farm, agri-food industry, for example, our energy industry.
Thank you. Now to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to thank both our guests, Professor Lam and Mr. Robertson. Good to see you again, Mr. Robertson. I want to follow up a little bit on Mr. Chong's questioning, and I have sort of two areas I'd like to talk about. One has to do with that security in the traditional sense of the word. I come at it a little differently than Mr. Chong, less on the side of assuming there will be an invasion and more on the side of how do we protect the status quo. When I speak to people from Taiwan, they're generally concerned about maintaining the status quo, which allows them to have a free democracy and have a vibrant business community and a cultural community that we have come to love. So as opposed to deterrence, in a military sense, are there diplomatic engagements, are there and defensive engagements as well that you could see that would be protecting the status quo and the kind of gentle standoff that continues at this time? Mr. Robertson first.
Thank you, sir. Well, I think, yes, I'm a former diplomat, so I put the first emphasis on diplomacy. But as I was saying to Mr. Chong, you need hard power to back up the kind of soft power approach, which is traditionally our approach, and that means engagement. And so I strongly believe that the engagement on issues where we can work with the People's Republic of China, climate, health concerns, nuclear proliferation, there are a number of areas where we can and should be working together. We know we have significant trade, which benefits Canadians. I think that's something that the more engagement we have, but at the same time passing the message that we aren't going to upset the current status quo as regards to the status of Taiwan, because that is, of course, the great fear of Xi Jinping is that we're going to kind of recognize Taiwanese independence. I don't see that happening. I don't see the Americans doing that, even though there are some American members of Congress who would like to see that. But I think the Taiwanese people, as you correctly point out, sir, are certainly not inclined to do that because they would like to leave the current status quo. But we do so at the same time, sir, in collaboration with our other allies. And I think through working with Australia, working with like-minded Korea, Japan, with partners in the CPTPP, again, engagement, because there has got to be, in my experience, another side within China. It is, yes, it's a one-party state, but certainly my experience and long experience with China is that there are factions within China. Right now, there is one faction that's in the ascendancy, as we saw at the National People's Congress, but you can be sure behind the scenes there are others who would not necessarily agree with the current fairly aggressive approach.
And my approach on this would be to diffuse, to de-escalate while defending. I mean, I think we need to do all of that at the same time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the cybersecurity aspect as well as the traditional security aspect and election interference. Before the 2020 presidential elections, there were overt and aggressive signs that China was wanting to or willing to or actually engaging in interference in the Taiwan election. It didn't work. The president was reelected and the status quo remained. Are there some tools or techniques that Taiwan has developed to counter misinformation, election interference, the kinds of activities that we're worried about in Canada as well, that we can learn from Taiwan? And that could be Professor Lam first, maybe, and then Mr. Robertson.
Thank you for the question. I think earlier, Mr. Robertson actually mentioned the minister and Andrew Tong, the digital minister, and I think that one of the things that they set up was a rapid response center to any form of misinformation or disinformation. In other words, that anything that comes out would be very quickly and verified. And I think that's something that's extremely, extremely useful and important for any liberal democracy, because as we see in the past few years, right, one of the confusion is that we don't, the general public do not necessarily know when you have a large amount of information, including a lot of the disinformation and misinformation that often become confusing to the point that people have difficulty to align themselves with the policy of the government, precisely because they sometimes become questioning those. And I think Taiwan definitely have a system that are in place. There's a lot that in which that I believe that one of the examples that Canada could learn from.
Mr. Robertson, could we ask you to turn your camera off? We are still getting some bandwidth issues, and perhaps if you turn your camera off, the audio will be improved.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, it does. It sounds better. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. Yes, I agree with Professor Lam. I also sit on the Defense Advisory Board, which reports to the Deputy Minister of National Defense and the Chief of Defense Staff. And I recently participated in a project, I mean, this is not secret, looking at disinformation. And just to answer the question, I learned an awful lot from Taiwan. The two places where I think we can learn a lot from are first Taiwan. They encounter cyber intrusions daily. And again, Minister Tang, who likes Canada, to visit Canada, they have, there is a lot we can learn from them. The other group would, of course, be the Baltic nations, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. I think they're the furthest ahead because they are the subject to cyber attacks from Russia in the case of the Baltics. And of course, China has been practicing on Taiwan for some time. So to Mr. Oliphant's question, yes, there's an awful lot we could learn from this. I believe that our intelligence agencies are in touch, but this is something, again, that if a parliamentary committee were to visit, they would learn an awful lot from this that I think would help inform parliamentarians, who I believe should be well informed on this, because you are ultimately the guarantor of our democracy.
Thank you. Now to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us this evening and providing us with information on our mandate, which is to study our relationship with Taiwan. In a recent speech in the Monk's School of Global Affairs, Melanie Joly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said that Canadian companies that deal with the PRC do so at their own risk. And she also said that Canada will try to tighten its relationship with Taiwan. What does that mean? What does a statement like this mean to Canadian companies? I'll start with Dr. Lam.
Without being a trade expert, I think that it seems to me increasingly that it become a common sense that trade and commerce has been weaponized. And of course, it's not just by China; it's quite common, right? But China being a economic superpower means that when they choose to weaponize trade, it is a very powerful weapon, right? So, and I think that is something that any Canadian business, when they want to invest in China, they might want to consider that. And I wouldn't have advised them to business, but I think that's the implication of those choices are pretty obvious.
Mon autre question peut-être.
I have a question for both witnesses. Do you not think that the membership of Taiwan in the CPTPP and the Agreement on Foreign Investment could be ways to make this statement by Minister Joly more tangible when she said that Canadian businesses that dealt with China did so at its own risk? And should we have to choose between the PRC and Taiwan for this Trans-Pacific Partnership, or if we're in a situation where we have to make a choice, what should our priority be? If we have to decide which country has to be excluded, how should we respond to Taiwan and to PRC with respect to the CPTPP?
Peut-être Monsieur Lam pour commencer.
We could begin with Dr. Lam.
Thank you for the question. Um, if there is a choice, right? When we're talking about when we encounter a situation where you have a industry, some sort of thinking about a specific case that could allow the business to make choices, I think the choice is pretty obvious, right? Because so this is one area one could think about. But I think to be realistic, that I think at this moment in time there are a lot of area that Taiwan simply it cannot replace China. So I think those is the challenging questions. But so again, if there are choices in the particular industry, particular area, and I think one of the things that I think a lot of people have to point out, that Canada definitely should also think about the critical supply chain, right? The resilience of the critical supply chain, and Taiwan could be obviously a partner for that. Once again, if they could provide that kind of industry in a particular area. Thank you.
Merci. Monsieur Robertson?
Thank you. Mr. Robertson.
Thank you. Under the current circumstances, China will not pass the tests of joining the CPT when it comes to state-owned enterprises and transparency. It won't be a question. We won't have to choose. Taiwan would, in my belief and what I've seen, qualify. So we wouldn't be put in that position of having to choose between one or the other, because you have to reach a certain standard. I think the Chinese recognize that as well, but the Taiwanese under the current circumstances would reach. And again, to the extent possible, we want to avoid antagonizing China. But in this case, I don't think they simply would not qualify without making radical changes, which I do not believe they're prepared to make.
Merci infiniment. D'ailleurs, je vais poursuivre.
Thank you. Mr. Robertson, I'd like to continue along with you with this is what they tell me the world takes, the cyber weapons arms race. You said that Taiwan is one of the best prepared countries when it comes to cybersecurity. You know that the Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Intelligence publicized a few months ago a report on cybersecurity. What lessons can Canada draw from Taiwan's experience in this field?
Well, again, I think there's an awful lot we can learn, and I think that our officials and our representative office in Taiwan are exploring it. But I think that again, I would recommend that members of Parliament, this committee, visit Taiwan and make that one of their stops. Certainly my experience when I visited Taiwan was that they shared an awful lot, and I learned an awful lot. And when I recently did the report with the Defense Advisory Board, the Taiwanese were very forthcoming in the information, best practices they're prepared to share. And I know that some of we've got some good Canadian teams, groups that are looking at cybersecurity. They have learned from the Taiwanese example as well, because they've been subject to it. And again, it's all a question if you're under constant assault, as they have been for quite some time, and in many ways the Chinese are probably the best at it, even superior in some sense to the Russians, who seem to hire a lot of very smart young hackers. But the Chinese do this extremely professionally, as we have learned with intrusions, for example, into our grids and pipelines.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for their testimony. Very interesting responses, and of course, I think all of us in this room are trying to determine how we can best support Taiwan and deal with the constant but increasing threat that we are seeing against Taiwan. Obviously the fact that Taiwan is a democracy, the work that you do on the Sustainable Development Goals, the work that you do to support the LGBTQ community is very, very important. It aligns with all of our values. But I want to ask a few questions, I think, about the Indo-Pacific strategy that we are hopeful to hear. We did see some rumors of what will be in that Indo-Pacific strategy, though, again, it's a long-awaited strategy that we have not yet fully seen. But we did hear from the minister that Canada will oppose the escalation of military action against Taiwan and seek to deepen our economic ties with the self-governing island. This is a bit of a tricky question, and I'm trying to ask it in a way that I could get the answer, but not appear in any way to support what China is doing. But is there a risk of Canada increasing its economic impacts or economic relationship with Taiwan as being seen by by the Chinese government as being enraging. Would there be that risk there? And are there ways that we can mitigate that? Because I think it is very important that Canada does play that increased role. Perhaps Dr. Lam, I could start with you.
Thank you for the question. I think the question is how do we approach this? I think there are symbolic acts that often end up simply provoking China, but then there are things that could be done in with great substance at the lower level. I can think about not just economic ties, definitely that's one possibility, but I think the collaboration on issues about public health, on issues about indigenarities, and civil society in general. So I think this is important that Canada as a democracy, right, whatever policy that we end up pursuing in support of Taiwan has to have received broad public support. And I think to do that, I think it's extremely important for democracy to make the citizen to understand that we're talking about a pace that will people. So I think I know there's a lot of talk about Pacific strategies, semiconductor industry. I mean, all these are important, but at the same time, oftentimes I feel that we don't talk about Taiwan as a pace is abstract. Right. But at the same time, these are places where real people with social texture, if it's a very vibrant film industry, popular culture, when you think about Korean K-wave, one can argue that there is a T-wave, right? I think those things need to be elevated. And I don't think they will be provoking China at all by these sort of low levels civil society ties.
Mr. Robertson?
Well, the answer to your question is yes. We do have to be quite diplomatic and circumspect in how we do things because we do not want to see Canadians once again sort of taken hostage. So the way around that, in my view, is diplomacy. We now have a new ambassador in Beijing, which is good because she will get access to levels that others could not get access to. It engaged the Chinese ambassador here in Ottawa. The principle of no surprises is one that applies to all diplomacy, and that's talking with the Chinese before we do things. Megaphone diplomacy, I do think we should avoid. The Chinese practice it. We do so at our peril because they are bigger and they will take revenge bluntly, and it comes as we've seen in our pork and our beef and things like that. So use all the links we've got, the business ties we have. There are Canadian business linkages which go back decades that can keep informed and through diplomacy. But at the same time, we have to be forthright and about defense of our values, but do so in such a way that we don't sound preachy at the same time that we make our point. But again, as much as possible, quiet diplomacy is the route forward. I've observed Prime Minister Mulroney and Prime Minister Chrétien, and I thought that they managed the Chinese relationship pretty well. They were pretty clear about speaking to them around human rights, but they did so in a fashion that it was behind closed doors, and the Chinese did not feel embarrassed, because certainly my experience, Chinese, for some of the reasons Dr. Lam pointed out, the 100 years of humiliation, as they call it, are very sensitive, and face is hugely important, and we need to be sensitive to that on our part as well, because ultimately we have big interests in China, and we are much more useful to the rest of the world when we maintain that relationship with China.
Thank you. And Dr. Lam, you spoke about culture and that the Taiwan culture and supporting that culture and expanding that. You talk about civil society and enlarging the role or the partnerships with civil society. One of the other aspects we've heard about in this committee is, students from Taiwan have chosen to come to Canada in quite large numbers. And of course, that was stopped during COVID. Would that be another way, or is that another way that we could be working to strengthen our ties with Taiwan, to make sure that those opportunities are available to students again?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. I think that currently there is a lot of student traffic between Canada and Taiwan. And I think those are ways in which to exercise Canada's soft power, right? Part of it, Canada is also a brand name that's admitted globally, particularly in certain area. And higher education is one of the area that is one of our strengths as a brand. We attract a lot of students from Taiwan, and there's a lot of exchange between these two countries. And there's also at the level of higher education, also beyond, also between scholars and so on. And I think this is actually a very important point, because we do not simply attract students from Taiwan. We attract students from all over the world, including China. China being one of the biggest source of international students for Canadian universities, right? So in other words, Canada is actually, in a great position that to foster that kind of social ties between not simply Canadians and Taiwanese, but also, among Chinese, between Taiwanese and Chinese. And I think those is actually it's a great opportunity for us to mitigate any kind of potential tensions at the higher levels. And I think I agree with Mr. Robinson earlier that I think diplomacy and conversations are extremely important, but sometimes the lower level conversations are also very important, because when people realize that we're talking to real people, right? When mainland Chinese students actually be friends with Taiwanese students, they realize, we are actually rather similar. We share a lot of things, and I think that will become less likely.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Now we'll go to Mr. Kimmich for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is to Professor Lam. You had said in your opener that Taiwan is host to a lot of democracy activists who leave mainland China to continue their activism. Can you perhaps explain who these people are, and how does Taiwan protect them from, say, rendition back to the mainland and from persecution by the government in Beijing when they travel overseas? Or are these people basically then unable to leave Taiwan while they continue their activism?
Thank you. As far as I know, I think one of I think the beginning of that really started in 1989, when there was sort of beginning some of the student leaders of the uprising in Tiananmen Square fled to Taiwan, and some of them continue to stay. And then I think the most recent wave obviously was some of the activists from Hong Kong who fled to Taiwan, and they continue to live there. And I think they have publications. I don't really follow them very closely, but I noticed that their existence. And I'm not sure I can answer the question about Taiwan government's protection of the when they do international travel. As far as I know, some of the early generation of activists are definitely traveling around the world.
So just continuing on that thread, then, I wanted to better understand then, is it a policy of the government of Taiwan to basically be a welcoming place for dissidents from mainland China, whether it's Hong Kong or Beijing or any of the provinces?
Yes, I would say in general. In general, it's been welcoming, and I should add to this. And throughout the past few decades, there was major sort of youth activism in Taiwan, including the occupation of the legislatures a few years ago, and a lot of these traffics are going back and forth in different directions. So some scholars have pointed out some of the activism in Hong Kong was actually inspired by the Taiwanese counterpart. So there's a lot of traffic among the young activists. And Taiwan has, because what's going on elsewhere, has become this really a hotbed for Chinese-speaking political activists.
Canada has a very anemic approach, I'd say, when it comes to helping Hong Kong activists who are trying to leave. Their preference is usually to go to the United Kingdom. Many of those who come here are worried about being able to stay here as permanent residents in the long term. But would it also help the government of Taiwan if Canada perhaps took a bigger approach to relieve some of that pressure and offer itself up as a secondary destination, so people leaving from Hong Kong and mainland China go to Taiwan, and then cooperation between the Canadian government and the Taiwanese government would ensure that those activists could then come here and continue their activism from Canada instead of from Taiwan? So there's not always a Beijing, Taiwan conflict of hosting all these dissidents, but then also Canada could host them here as well. In the long term, they would just add to our communities, and because they're typically very, very strongly democracy activists, they would just add kind of to our long history of hosting people like this.
Thank you. I think probably would be a good idea, but I just want to point out that that's having a more relaxed policy in Canada doesn't mean automatically that those activists from Taiwan will end up in Canada. I think they are very different kind of cultural and economic and social contexts. I think those are the choices people make due to different circumstances. But you definitely have a strong points about the choice between Britain, the UK, and Canada, and because for the moment, I think anyone who have a overseas British passport, BNO overseas national passport can just land it in the UK, right? And they can't do the same thing in Canada, which sort of prevents us being the destination for those people. But most of them are not activists.
How much time do I have, Chair?
Enough time for a short answer and a short
It was
short question.
going to be to Mr. Robertson. Just he spoke about more support for universities and colleges to do more in Taiwan. So can you just elaborate on that?
Sure. I think that university presidents going and doing kind of marketing with perhaps provincial ministers would be a good thing. Again, the people-to-people ties, that is our great asset in the world. One of our great assets is that our universities and higher education is highly regarded. We have the capacity in Canada. Taiwan is a good place to attract people to come to Canada. The more of these ties we have throughout Asia, and includes China, let them see how a democracy works. They go back and they say, this stuff actually does work in places like Canada. And we are a pluralistic society. There's a reason why the Aga Khan set up his Center for Pluralism in Canada, because it works here. We're not perfect, we've got warts, but we're better than the rest of the world. That would also be my evaluation from my diplomatic career.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Kmitch. Now to Ms. Groh for 5 minutes or less.
Very much, Mr. Chair, and thank the committee very much for allowing me to fit in here for a few minutes today. But especially because you're studying Taiwan, and we recently came back with parliamentary friendship group that did a visit. In spite of the pushback, the committee stayed tough and stayed strong. And I wasn't sure we were going right up until we got there. But we got there. And nobody backed down in spite of emails and threats and the rest of it that was going to create World War III. You know what? Your colleagues and mine, we all stayed tough and had an absolutely wonderful visit. Was so impressed on their National Day and the speech that the president delivered about standing up against any kind of military force. They were not going to solely rely on their friends and neighbors, that they have invested billions of Taiwanese dollars into the defense system, created an all-out defense mobilization agency to protect them, and that they were not going to stand back and let anybody push them around. I think the Ukraine clearly created a big fear of reality, of the monster that they have next door to them. And I really would like to encourage the committee to go and to visit Taiwan, because I think it would be very, very beneficial to everyone. We visited a lot of the businesses that were there, and Northland Power is wind and solar, and it has a huge investment there and is bidding on multi-million-dollar projects for the wind and solar, and probably will be successful. Waterloo, University of Waterloo is signing an MOU with Taiwan right now on the issues of semiconductors and various other things. Taiwan offered to share their knowledge with academics from Canada when it came to the semiconductors and other things. They very much believe in sharing the knowledge. That was very impressive. One of the things that was also really very helpful, I'm going to listen to Professor Robertson, on the issue of your friends, and when things are tough, that's when you need your friends to stand by you. And there was a steady stream of parliamentary friendship groups going to Taiwan. Like, we left, another one arrived. It was every week there was another country showing up in Taiwan in order to send a message clearly to China that Taiwan has a huge amount of friends. But we have to be very careful diplomatically to continue to, I don't think we need to tiptoe as much as we do, but I think we have to use the diplomacy, and it's what Professor Robertson was indicating. Taiwan got where it's got because they're very diplomatic. They're quiet. They continue to advance everything that's going to be necessary to protect themselves. They're very strong economically. They've got huge budget surpluses that we could only dream about. But they're investing them in areas of protection and infrastructure. So I'd like to ask Mr. Robertson or Mr. Lam on the issue of the CPTPP, which is something that Taiwan very, very much should be part of, wants to be part of, has a campaign to be part of. Do you think that there would be much of a pushback? I think everybody's tiptoeing around because they're afraid to do anything in this time that's going to trigger anything, right? Even our visit. So do you think that if the CPTPP turned around and invited Taiwan to be part of it, even though China knows it doesn't deserve to be there in any way, shape, or form, do you think that it would trigger a very negative reaction?
Mr. Lam, would you like, or Dr. Lam, would you like to start?
Thank you. I don't know how to answer this question. In other words, it's really hard to speculate how China would respond. I think that it is always important, given its particular take on history and its understanding of its place in the world. I think it's extremely important that we need to have channel that's capable of communicating to them so that it's understood that this is not an act of provocation. I think anything that has to be done in such a way, right? Because the question is specifically whether we provoke them. I think anything could potentially be read in such a way. Any acts that are particularly that would be seen as either isolating them or changing them, and I think those is the biggest fear that they would have. And so I think those are some of the parameters that one have to consider for any kind of policy. Thank you.
Mr. Robertson?
China won't like it, but remember when China came into the World Trade Organization and they're part of that, we recognized plurilateral trade agreements, and Taiwan is also part of the World Trade Organization. So you can argue that it's simply a continuation of something that China has already agreed to, but of course they'll react. But I will say this, my 5 years in Hong Kong convinced me that the big challenge ahead of us is not between right and left or between our parties, it's between open and closed systems. And that, I think, is going to be the fundamental challenge for our time. And I think that's where your observations about democracy and standing with your friends, you can't be shy about it, because if we are, we're going to lose it. And so I think supporting Taiwan to become a member of the CPTPP, because they will qualify, they are an important economy. I think that they would legitimately qualify. And I think China won't like it, but China, I think if they follow through the logic of them having joined the WTO and recognizing the rules of the WTO, they'd have to accept it.
Thank you very much. With that, that brings us to the end of our first panel. So we would like to thank Professor Robertson and Dr. Lam for your time with us this evening. Thank you. And we'll suspend briefly while we bring in our second panel. A quick note to everyone. Yes, sir.
N'avons-nous pas...
Don't we have a minute to ask questions of these panelists?
Pretty much the hour, and we have a vote coming up which will subtract from the time of our second panel. So unfortunately, we'll cut it off right now and launch the second panel. My regrets there. Just a quick note on that. Our third panel tonight, again, based on our experience last week, will not appear because they did not have the appropriate headset. So we'll go through, we'll have the vote, and that will be it for our session tonight. But we want to give everybody ample time in the second panel, and so that's why we'll bring them on now.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Back in session, so we're pleased to welcome on our second panel Dr. Justin Massey, a full professor, Université de Québec à Montréal, and co-director, Network for Strategic Analysis. And from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director and Senior Fellow Indo-Pacific Program. In the first panel, by the way, we're fairly loose on the timing. If we can keep our time to the allotted amount, everybody will get 2 opportunities to ask questions. So with that, we will invite Dr. Massey for 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Sir, welcome to our committee.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to be focusing today on 3 basic questions that we need to ask ourselves to understand Canada's position with respect to Taiwan. The first is we need to define what are the interests that Canada needs to defend. Secondly, it's what should our level of ambition be to defend these interests. And finally, what measures or what means should be used to reach this level of ambition. When it comes to interests, I'm going to focus on what I feel is the most basic interest of Canada, and that is, of course, you can understand, that is to preserve peace, meaning specifically we have to prevent an invasion and a declaration of independence. We're currently living in a very tense time with Ukraine and also with the ascension of China, which will reach its summit in 2013. And declining powers are more inclined to take risks vis-a-vis China, and it shows that those declining powers are definitely more inclined to take risks. The modernization of of China, which has gone from 2035 to 27. The White Book on Taiwan is clear, the desire to annex Taiwan against the will of the Taiwanese people. So the interest here is to deter any aggression and to maintain the status quo, the policy of a one China. It's kind of a de facto independence of Taiwan. Secondly, is we need to ensure the freedom of movement in the maritime seaways. We have to deter a Chinese blockade. We have to strengthen international law through multilateralism, not only for the marine area, but we also have to think about the deficit of regulation. The third interest is to reduce Canada's vulnerability with respect to Chinese actions. Should there be a conflict, we need to makes Canada very vulnerable. So we have to strengthen the resilience and the security of our supply chains. And then we have to look at a sectoral decoupling in strategic industries. We have to thwart disinformation and deal with hostile meddling, particularly in the area of elections. We have to diverse and strengthen commercial ties in the Indo-Pacific region with Taiwan and also members of the region such as Japan and ASEAN members. We have to increase non-governmental exchanges in the area of intelligence, parliamentary associations, universities, etc. And finally, another interest that we need to focus on is to fight against the impact of climate change. We can see through the various fora that this is a source of tension. The second element that I'd like to deal with now is the fact that Canada has limited resources, and we're dealing with Europe and other areas. So we have to define the level of ambition that we want to have and the available capacity. I think that Canada can take greater leadership in the fight against disinformation, but we can also influence the area as well in the area of cybersecurity, climate resilience of institution, and we can contribute since we're not. When I talk about the situation of deterrence, we call this the hedgehog strategy, where we enable Taiwan to prepare for a conflict. Canada has limited capacity in terms of this area. Canada has a hard time maintaining 2 frigates in the area, and so we are undergoing a modernization process, but we are limited in our capacity. Same thing for our rapid capacities. We've seen this in Ukraine. It takes a lot of time, as we saw with our mission to Lithuania. Dr. Massey?
Your 5 minutes is up, and we want to turn things over now to Director Miller for 5 minutes or less.
Well, thank you to the chair, members of the committee for the invitation again to speak before you today on such an important topic to Canada's interests in the Indo-Pacific and indeed our relationship with Taiwan. On the topic of the day, Canada, in my belief, we should recognize the benefits of a more robust relationship with Taiwan. For too long, successive Canadian governments have failed to seize opportunities to bolster ties with Taipei, largely as a result of fear that expanded ties with Taiwan would lead to punitive measures or other repercussions in the relationship with China. In effect, we have allowed the parameters of our Taiwan relationship to be boxed in at the edges by China, and it's in my view that this formula is far too simple. Of course, Canada has its own one China policy, but that does not mean that we should avoid taking steps to bolster relations with Taiwan, even if unofficial diplomatically in nature. Frankly put, Taiwan plays a pivotal role in the Indo-Pacific and is a robust democracy in a region where resilient and sustained democratic values are scarce. Taiwan also has a thriving civil society and advanced technology base and shares core values with Canada on the freedom of speech, open elections, and the rule of law. In this context, how should we prioritize relations with Taiwan and seize these opportunities? First of all, I think there needs to be a recognition that Taiwan's security is our security. Taiwan's place in the Indo-Pacific order is ignored or quietly dismissed as quote unquote politically inconvenient at our own peril. On trade matters, Canada should, in tandem with other partners such as Japan, as the largest economy right now in this agreement, be vocal in its support for Taiwan's accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. Probably the worst acronym I can imagine, but that none to be said. Complementing this would be the swift finalization of a Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, or FIPA, through which both sides agree to explore talks earlier this year. On the security matters, the maintenance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is of paramount interest both to Canada and its regional allies and partners. Geostrategically, Taiwan is the middle of the first island chain in the Western Pacific, acting as the strategic spine connecting the East China Sea in the north and the South China Sea in the south. It's important to understand this maritime continuum as all states in the region, including China, depend on its open sea lines of communication in order to facilitate open trade, move energy supplies, and many other materials. Any contingency or clash over Taiwan would have a momentous implications for Canada and our allies. This would not be a conflict where we could insulate ourselves. The potential for regional spillover would be acute. A telling example of this is that Japan's Southwest Archipelago sits just on the northern edge of Taiwan. The island of Yonaguni, for example, in Japan is less than 70 miles from Taiwan. The idea, frankly, that a conflict over Taiwan could be narrow and not impact the wider region is a fantasy. While it remains unclear if the leadership in Beijing has politically made the choice to invade Taiwan, we are seeing an unprecedented level of economic and military coercion in recent days, as well as provocative series of ballistic missile tests and military exercises around Taiwan earlier this year after the visit of U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. The upcoming Indo-Pacific strategy should recognize a couple important points on Taiwan. First, it should acknowledge that Taiwan's security and stability in the Taiwan Strait is of utmost importance. Second, it should specifically identify the desire to enhance economic engagement with Taiwan's dynamic economy and look for more areas for Canadian innovators and entrepreneurs to engage in a shared ecosystem premised on reliable and secure supply chains. And third and finally, it should identify that the Indo-Pacific region needs more cooperation in provision of public goods, and specifically identify an example of where Taiwan could help. An example of this is through its cooperation in the World Health Assembly. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, the Indo-Pacific region is rightly garnering attention, albeit quite late, in Ottawa as the global center of geoeconomic and geostrategic gravity. In the pursuit of our interests and values, it is essential to view Taiwan as a part of the solution and not a part of the problem towards stability in this dynamic region. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for your time, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Director Miller. Now for our first 6 minutes, we'll go to Ms. Dancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Miller, I'm going to start with you. I would like your, just to start off, your assessment of whether allies come to the aid of Taiwan or not. Do you believe that'll sort of establish what the other Asian countries who may be threatened by China in future will do, if they'll stand up to China or if they may not. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Do you think the rest of Asian countries are watching how we react if we come to the defense of Taiwan or not?
Well, I think absolutely that they will be looking at this. And I think for too long, when a lot of countries in the region have looked at Canada, the view has been one-sided. I think they've seen a Canadian government interested in investment and trade, but they haven't seen the other side of that coin, which is a robust sort of commitment to security in the region. And another thing to remind on this point is that I think a lot of the countries in the region also are heavily invested in a contingency over Taiwan. I think the example I mentioned on Japan being 70 miles away from Taiwan, there's no way that a contingency or a conflict happens over Taiwan and Japan doesn't find itself somewhat involved in this. So I think, again, the idea of thinking of this as a narrow U.S.-China contingency, I don't think makes a whole lot of sense.
Do you feel that the U.S. So you feel that Japan, if the U.S. does nothing, that Japan could be the one to act? Is that what you're saying?
I don't believe that Japan will act in isolation, but I think if the United States is engaged in a conflict, I think Japan and likely Australia, potentially even the Philippines as a treaty ally, would play a role. What type of role, I think would take a much longer discussion, and I think that's not public, but I think that they would play some sort of a role in such a contingency.
It does seem if the Americans would, that Taiwan may fare a lot better in defense if they could. I think that's a given. But if they don't, I appreciate your perspective that others would come to the aid of Taiwan. But it seems like when the Americans discuss Taiwan, they rarely mention Canada at all. And it seems to be that they don't feel that we're a relevant player in the Indo-Pacific. We're not an AUKUS. We're not part of the quadrilateral security dialogue, pardon me. We really haven't been doing a whole heck of a lot to equip our Arctic for defense. Just wondering if you can weigh in on your thoughts on that. Are we a relevant player in the Indo-Pacific in terms of Taiwan or others in the minds of the U.S., and is that important?
I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think if you look at the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, I did a quick search, a PDF search of Canada, and it came up 0 times. There's no mention of Canada. And I think in discussions with Americans, they won't say that we're doing this to punish you and say that whether it's certain decisions in your relationship with China, but it's just that we didn't think of you. So what is worse, to be punished or to be irrelevant in these discussions? And I would argue that the irrelevance is probably a worse sort of outcome, but I think that's the reality right now on this specific matter.
Do you think that because we haven't made ourselves a relevant player at the table in the Indo-Pacific, it seems to me when we had the situation with the 2 Michaels that the Americans could have done a lot more perhaps to support us in that, and they did not. Is this part of the reason why they did not move more mountains to come to our aid? That we haven't shown that a relevant player? I'm just wondering if that has anything to do with it, and if they would have done more to help us, if we were doing more to help ourselves and our allies to ensure that we're part of the conversation at the table with the Indo-Pacific.
Well, with regards specifically to the issue of the detention of the 2 Michaels, I couldn't give you a firm answer on that. There were a lot of different moving parts. There were different administrations in the United States that spanned over. This was a judicial decision as well. So I think there were a number of different angles, but I do think that the core point that the United States principally hasn't thought of Canada as the most favored partner in the Indo-Pacific is definitely a fair assessment.
So can you comment at all of what we should be focusing on? I mean, Canada we know is a smaller country compared to, of course, the U.S. or China, but I do think that there are things that we could be doing, particularly in the Arctic. Can you comment at all? I mean, if we're going to do anything, I think we need to show some strength, and it seems like the Arctic would be a natural place to start, given China is now saying it's a near Arctic country, so to speak, and obviously wants to play a role in what happens with the Arctic. Do you agree, or where should we begin in this regard?
I do think the Arctic's a key area. I also think the North Pacific. So, I mean, you look at Operation Neon, which we've been engaged in for several years to ensure that North Korea isn't able to circumvent sanctions. I think this is another tangible example of where the Canadian military is playing a role. We need to start finding more of these niches. We do have good capabilities, and I think these are some examples.
I believe the last time you were here, you mentioned that Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, although we don't have the concrete one yet, but what has been unwritten so far has been, to quote you, has been overly focused on economic and investment and needs to realize, quote, the severe security challenges in this region. With some of my remaining time, can you elaborate on that? And do you feel the signals we're getting from the forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy from Minister Joly will meet the needs that you outlined the last time you were at this committee?
Well, I think that, again, I mean, I'm a big fan of the CPTPP. I think it's a great for our businesses, and it's a great way to engage with our key partners. But I think the reality is that should be just one piece. And we can't go to Japan, we can't go to South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, and just have discussions on trade. They're all facing significant security concerns across the board. So I do hope that the Indo-Pacific strategy addresses this. I do see some nuggets of goodness so far in what I've seen on this. But the reality is we have to make sure that this is a long-term commitment. This cannot be a box ticker, a 1 year or 2 year effort. This needs to be for the long term.
Thank you, Director
Thank you
Miller.
very much.
Now we'll go to Ms. Sgro for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much again. And to Mr. Miller, when we talk about investments and security and moving the dial along and becoming relevant rather than irrelevant in some ways, many of the 60,000 people that currently live in Taiwan are Canadian citizens living in Taiwan. Many investments, Northland Power as an example, are bidding on large multinational projects in offshore wind. I asked them the question when we visited them a couple of weeks ago about concern about the future given some of the ongoing issues with China. And people were very confident that no one was going to pull a trigger or do something dramatic, that they could confident that things would continue to go along the way they are now, and the investment of Canada's pension funds and so on was in a good place. What's your thought on that?
Well, I think that it's interesting, this discussion right now of decoupling, for example, in the Chinese case, and finding areas that we should decouple or sectorially segregate. And one of the arguments against that always comes to the fact that the supply chains, for example, if we were to do something with China, we have supply chains that connect through Japan and South Korea and a lot of other alliances. But it's interesting that when Taiwan gets brought up, that same comparison and discussion doesn't come up, because from my point of view, Taiwan is very, very important in the supply chains, especially in the tech supply chains. We think of semiconductors, obviously, first and foremost, but many of the other sectors, they're very, very crucial to some of our investors. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well, how critical Taiwan is, not just for the investments and its sort of private sector ecosystem itself, but how that interconnects with the other key economies in that region, which we're already engaged in. So I think that's a really, really key point to keep in mind.
The fact that Taiwan is the biggest manufacturer of semiconductors around, and we are all so dependent on that, it seems to me that's another reason for China to just bide their time and not be over anxious to be causing additional problems.
I think you're right. And I think there's two main stories that I think we need to keep in mind here. Semiconductors is one, obviously, in any contingency. The second one is energy security. So if we think that we're having problems right now in Europe, and we are having problems with our European allies now being freezed off Russian gas, just imagine what might happen in a contingency over Taiwan, where effectively China controls all of the waterways that would feed the energy to Japan and South Korea, which rely on 85 to 90% of their energy coming from the Gulf. So there's no other way to get it there easily. So there are two main vector points here, energy security and semiconductors, that we need to be keep an eye on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sgro. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Massey wasn't able to conclude, and I think that he had an opportunity to discuss many issues that Canada is dealing with respect to Taiwan. However, I'd like to hear what he has to say about what Canada could do to deal with these issues that were identified very well by Dr. Massey in his opening statement. Thank you for your question and enabling me to conclude my statement. Yes, I think we have to look at the means. We have to look at way that Canada can play a leadership role and act as an ally, how we can influence the situation, and what we can do to contribute. In terms of leadership, Canada's strength is made apparent in many ways. Two issues do come to mind that Canada can use: the strategy to deal with disinformation. Canada could show a lot more leadership and develop ways to fight against this attempt to really challenge the truth and redefine history and the narrative. Unfortunately, Canada is also a target for this, but we have to work with our allies and exchange information, better information. As for the other elements, as far as our influence is concerned, strengthening our institutions or military defense, Mr. Berkshire Miller, in his presentation and the answers that he provided to our Conservative colleague, talked about our intervention capacity in case of a conflict with Taiwan, that is a PRC Taiwanese conflict. But I believe that you both talked about the importance of working in collaboration with allies in the region to try to prevent such a conflict from occurring. Mr. Colby, who unfortunately we will not be hearing from today, said that the risk of invasion from the PRC over this decade is real, and we need to be aware of these threats. It can lead the Republic to react before a coalition of allies can get together and respond. So in your opinion, perhaps beginning with Mr. Massey, how can we ensure that this coalition of allies is established quickly so that we will be able to respond quickly to any measures taken by the PRC? First of all, we have to have the capacity, a rapid response capacity. We don't have this capacity to deal with a prolonged war. And these capacities take a lot of time to establish. So if you want to have peace, you have to prepare for war. In order to deploy this reaction force, we have to, well, if we're afraid of the costs involved, if we're sure that the Americans would respond, well, we understand this will be very costly. That's what we need to do. We have to have this threat of a rapid response, and we have to be able to do it. We have to have the capacity to do this. Right now, we don't have this capacity. And we've seen what's happened with the military exercises that we've conducted with our allies. Mr. Miller.
For the question, and just to add to what my colleague said, I think there's three main points. I would agree on deterrence. So we absolutely need to build up deterrent capability. Many of the allies in Asia do as well. So, for example, Japan still hovers around 1% of GDP spending, almost half of what NATO requires for most of its allies, even though some of them don't meet 2%. I think Japan is one example of an ally that needs to be doing more in terms of defense spending. Deterrence is a big one. The second one, obviously, is diplomacy. I think that we need to work publicly and also privately to signal to the Chinese that there are certain thresholds, there are certain red lines that can't be crossed. And the third one is contingencies. We have to talk very privately with the Americans, with our Five Eyes allies, and with other partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific about the what if, about the worst situation possible, and how do we prepare for that. Some of that will be public message, but a lot of that needs to be privately done.
Une des choses qui pourrait peut-être être faite.
I'd like to have your opinion on the following issue. AUKUS and Quad. What do you think about us joining this?
Very brief answer, if you could, please, Dr. Messi.
I think this would be a good idea, given that Canada has been excluded from most of the regional security institutions with AUKUS and Quad, and there has to be a consensus amongst allies. We need to have a common front, and that's what Canadian multilateralism is all about. In Canada, it would be in our interest to do this.
Thank you very much. Now to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses for their testimony tonight. I mean, ultimately, what I'm hearing over and over again is that Canada has to do more. That in fact, Mr. Miller, you've said Canada is late to the game. I guess we have heard as well that Canada can and should show more leadership. I guess one of the questions that I have for both of you is knowing that is the case, knowing that we do have there is more that needs to be done, that can be done. Who should we be taking lessons from? Is this something, are there lessons we can learn from Australia? Are there lessons we can learn from South Korea, Japan, some of those other countries that are working and dealing with this thorny issue of Taiwan? Perhaps, Mr. Miller, I could start with you.
Well, that's a great question. And I think I would start with the point that when crafting a successful strategy, empathy is essential. So obviously, we need to be focusing on the interests that matter the most to Canadians, the values that matter the most to Canadians. But if we do that without actually asking those in the region where we're providing aid, we're providing assistance, it's going to fall flat. We need to have a two-way conversation where we're actually talking to the region rather than just sort of foisting upon deliverables and grants of money that don't sort of suit their needs. So I think that's the first important point. As far as learning others' regional strategies, I would start in the region itself. This is not to discount our European friends who are also thinking about the Indo-Pacific, but one thing I often say is that we are not Europe. I mean, yes, we have great social connections with Europe, but we have a huge Pacific coastline. We are very much an Indo-Pacific nation. Our Dutch friends would tell us this. Our Dutch friends had an Indo-Pacific strategy a year and a half before we still don't have ours out. They don't have a Pacific coastline. I guess they had Indonesia back in the day. But we need to start thinking about ourselves and realizing that we are a Pacific nation. And I would say the ones that we should take the most advice from would be the Japans, the Australias of the world, as well as some voices in Southeast Asia.
Mr. Massey?
Oui, je suis d'accord.
I agree. And we have to look at the updated Australian strategy, as well as that of France as well. There is a lot of French territory in the Indo-Pacific area, and France has tried to find a mid-position with respect to Taiwan and China. I think that the French is trying to find the French strategy is trying to find a diplomatic and middle ground but prepare so that they're able to react should a conflict arise. And that's where the problem lies with Canada. Our capacity to react should there be a conflict.
To point out to everybody, the bells are ringing for a vote. I need unanimous consent to continue on until perhaps, about 5 minutes before the vote? Is that sufficient for everybody to do what they need to do? Are we good? Right. Please continue then, Ms. McPherson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the unanimous consent, everyone. So I think that is an excellent point, that we do need to listen to those people who are in the region. however, one of the worries, with regards to the geopolitical situation is that you talk, Mr. Miller, about the energy security and how that ties into what is happening with energy insecurity and the weaponization of energy with the war in Ukraine. We did see Chancellor Scholz go to China recently, and he did speak about Taiwan and cautioned the Chinese government against escalations in Taiwan. I do wonder what you feel the implications are of the war in Ukraine and how the Chinese government is seeing what is happening there with regards to what is happening in Taiwan, whether that gives them a feeling of security to escalate, whether that makes them think that perhaps the world has got their attention diverted elsewhere. Perhaps you could comment on that.
It's a great question. I think that there are two different angles that China is taking away from this. One is obviously concern, because I think that they're seeing how strong the West has sort of bandied together on this, especially on financial sanctions. They don't want to be in a scenario like that where they also suffer from those sanctions. I mean, especially on technology, for example. Technology is the gasoline that makes the Chinese economy go. If we were able to effectively cut off a lot of that technology to China, I think it would be an economic nightmare for them. So I think they're getting that lesson. But at the same point, I think that they're seeing some of the weaknesses and trying to exploit that as well. So I think one example of this is how they're taking advantage of the cheap energy prices to buy Russian gas and oil at 30% discounts. There was one story where they're selling off U.S. shale LNG contracts now to our allies in the region, such as Japan and South Korea, at market prices, while at the same point getting 30% discounts on Russian gas. The double irony is that's our LNG, because it's our LNG that goes down through the United States, and China's profiting off that and profiting off the war in Ukraine. So there's two sides to the story, I think.
Mr. Massey, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I agree that China is realizing when it looks at the war in Ukraine that it has to be well prepared. They can see the difficulties Russia is experiencing militarily, so they're going to be able to try and get air superiority, and they have to exploit all of the divisions that exist between the allies. There's the issue of the price of energy in Europe. They have to try and get less support for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go to Mr. Genuis for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. My questions will focus on the risk of another catastrophic war in the Asia-Pacific resulting from a possible PRC invasion of Taiwan and Canada's response. On January 12, 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech at the National Press Club in Washington in which he defined the U.S. defense perimeter in the Pacific. His defense perimeter excluded Korea. And so 6 months later, communists invaded South Korea, leading to the loss of 40,000 American lives as well as many Canadians and others. The communists invaded South Korea because they calculated that nobody would come to its defense. Tragically, President Biden repeated this mistake in December last year. He promised heavy sanctions, but also explicitly ruled out an American military response to a further invasion of Ukraine, and so Russia invaded Ukraine 2 months later. When hostile countries are making decisions about acts of aggression, they generally make amoral but rational calculations about whether the costs will outweigh the benefits. The lesson of history is that making commitments to stand with democracies against aggression is the most pro-peace path available because it deters aggression. Committing to defending allies from attack is a way of communicating in advance that the cost of invasion will be high and thus deter invasion. Now, this leads me to the conclusion that Western nations should be clear in their commitment to stand with Taiwan, and that clear commitment would deter war. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would not be the result of a perceived provocation because China's leaders are highly rational. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would only occur if Taiwan's leaders were convinced, as Putin was in February, that the nation being invaded would not be protected. So with that in mind, I submitted a written question to the Canadian government simply asking, has the government made any plans related to how it will respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? And if so, what are the plans? In responding to this question, the government noted its concern about potential escalation and its desire to engage in terms of trade and technology, but the government provided no information whatsoever about its plans for responding to an invasion. So, Mr. Miller, I wanted to ask you, what can Canada do to avoid the failure of deterrence that we have seen in the current Ukrainian war and in the Korean War, as I spoke about, and what should Canada's plan be for responding to an invasion of Taiwan?
Well, thank you. I think it's an excellent point. I think it needs to start with the premise that, as I mentioned in my remarks, that any contingency over Taiwan, this is not a luxury. This is not one that we insulate ourselves from. This is not Iraq 2003. This is not a potential conflict of choice. If the United States is involved in kinetic action and a hot conflict in East Asia versus China, its only peer competitor, we are intimately involved. Often I just tell people to look at a map. The idea that we could opt out of this one, I think, is not feasible. Getting before that, though, how do we sort of prepare for this? How do we plan contingencies? I think that we need to work much more closely with a lot of our multilateral engagements. The Five Eyes, for example, traditionally is a signals intelligence arrangement. I think we need to start thinking much more closely with the Five Eyes partnerships on broader terms. I think in foreign policy terms, in defense terms, I think we need to be thinking and preparing about these contingencies and finding ways to avoid them. I also think, lastly, that when it comes to our boots on the ground, I don't often put this all on the backs of the Royal Canadian Navy. I think we need to start thinking diplomatically and also in terms of our security officials overseas. We need to have much bigger presence to understand the intelligence on the ground. The Five Eyes were a net recipient of that. We need to start having our own intelligence in a robust sense there and really understanding what's happening in that part of the world.
Is it fair to say that a stronger presence and more clear commitments to support of Taiwan would decrease the likelihood of invasion?
I think that it should be standard and not be controversial. For example, in almost every referencing to the Indo-Pacific, to be talking about the stability and security in the Taiwan Strait. Before, even a year ago, and perhaps even now, it's controversial for some government officials to mention this. I think that this should be absolutely, in any time that we're mentioning the Indo-Pacific, this should be first and foremost. Because, as I said, without Taiwanese security, there is no Japanese security. There is no security in the South China Sea. So I think that we need to be upfront about this. We can't be reactive and just wait for a question period to have to say it if we have to. I think this needs to be right in the front of our Indo-Pacific strategy and foremost to our interests.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Janos, you are out of time. We'll go to Mr. Fragas-Gaddis for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you to our witnesses. Professor Massey, I'll begin with you. And by the way, this is not related to anything that we're doing here, but we just missed each other at Queen's University. I studied with David Haglund and Wayne Cox, and I know you know them and others there. But I do take your points that you've raised tonight, particularly the one that you raised with respect to climate change, that offers a potential area of collaboration with China. The point has been made before at this committee and elsewhere. But I wonder, how would that work? How could that proceed? Because on the one hand, I think I see where you and others have made that point are coming from. Climate change is an existential matter by definition, and therefore we should, on existential matters, existential threats specifically, find room for collaboration, cooperation with all states, regardless of whether or not they're democracies. But at the same time, Canada is a middle power, and China certainly is not. So where China can find room to collaborate with the United States, and I see that there's been very positive, or what seem to be very positive conversations vis-a-vis President Xi and Biden in the past few days on the issue specifically of climate change, one could make the argument that the U.S. is more likely to be heard by China on the issue of climate change, and the door opens to discussion and deliberation between those two superpowers. But Canada is not in that category, clearly. So how do we get China's attention on this? And in what areas can we specifically focus on to advance the dialogue?
Merci pour la question. D'abord, il faut reconnaître le problème.
Thank you for your question. Even with the engagement announced by Beijing, it's insufficient that it won't allow us to meet the climate change objectives. We have to go further. This applies to Canada as well. Canada can't do much to influence the Chinese position, but our strength is to rally its allies and work with like-minded states. And one of the ideas that is now being discussed in Europe, in the European Union, is to impose customs duties based on the pollution rates of international imports. If there's international consensus with respect to that, with respect to commercial trade, and that we impose costs on pollution, I think that's one of the ways that we can influence China and get better cooperation. We're naive to think that that all countries are going to want to cooperate. The Chinese will to not compartmentalize. That is, to make links between cooperation on climate change and Taiwan. Well, you have to break that. And the only way to do this, I think, for Canada is to cooperate, have common strategies, and even impose costs on pollution.
Question. I'll go to Mr. Berkshire Miller. The point has been made, and I think it's a compelling one, that because Canada has been blessed with the 3 Fs, food, fertilizer, and what is the last F? My goodness, yeah. Food, fertilizer, and fuel, excuse me, that this offers an opportunity for leverage in terms of international security. How can those 3 Fs be leveraged to promote security in this particular region and that of Taiwan in particular?
Well, it's a really great question. I think every country needs to strengthen or look at their strengths in some of these contingencies and play them up. And I think we're seeing a clear example of this with Russia's war in Ukraine. I think that one of the roles that Canada can play, should play, is in the 3 Fs that you mentioned. In a potential contingency in Asia, and I think this is key for Taiwan, but when I mention a Taiwan contingency, I also think of Japan and South Korea. Again, imagine the potential coercion they would face on all of those Fs, on agricultural supplies, on energy, on fertilizers. That is a role that Canada needs to be preparing for in any contingency, is finding ways, and we can't do this 1 year ahead. We need to be doing this 5 to 10 years ahead in planning, that we can ensure the food security, the energy security, fertilizer security to our most important allies in Northeast Asia. So I think it's a really great question and one that we should be paying attention to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vargas-Gatos. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know whether you have heard about what happened, heard the first panel, but there was a statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs before the Munk School of Global Affairs, and she said that Canadian companies that deal with PCR do so at its own peril, that Canada should try to strengthen its economic ties with Taiwan. We know to what extent the PRC is trying to threaten the various nations throughout the world, and individually as well, trying to isolate them. Do you think that this doctrine that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is referring to, do you think that will lead to retaliation from the People's Republic of China? I think that, first of all, we have to be able to explain the decisions that we make. And if we can show, and it's easy to do so, there's evidence that there are threats to the private sector when we deal with China, that there are, if we're able to show this, if we can explain what these Canadian irritants are, particularly in strategic areas. And we're talking about big sectors, high tech. That's where I think we have to reduce our vulnerability. And it's not something that's specific to Canada. What China is trying to do, and we saw this with Australia, they know they can't hurt U.S. So one way of doing this is to come up with a common front. And that's what Canada has to do. Reduce its vulnerability, but work with other countries. We have to because we have to remember that if our companies become more and more vulnerable, and there'll be a theft of intellectual property and other problems.
Monsieur Berkshire Miller.
Mr. Berkshire Miller.
Thank you. Well, I think the intention is right with the minister's remarks on this. There's a lot of challenges, economic espionage, forced technology transfer, et cetera, in China. But I think the remedy really is a consistent and sustained dialogue with the private sector. This cannot be a one warning in one speech saying that private sector needs to be aware of the risks in China. I think we need a consistent and sustained dialogue with the private sector on these risks and involving them in these decisions. So not making it seem like the government's telling the private sector, but having a long-term dialogue with them on this matter.
And now to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Miller, you talked about the fact that technology is the gas that runs the Chinese economy, and you know, obviously we're all very aware of that. But could you just, in this very short time, talk a little bit about how important it is, or the value of Canada divesting or diversifying, I guess, the two Ds, divesting and diversifying from technology with China, but also increasing our own production of some of those vital technology pieces?
Well, thank you for the excellent question. I think there's two pieces to this. So there's the critical components of technology, semiconductors, et cetera, quantum technology, but it's also the components that drive that as well. So it's the critical and raw materials. There's two sides to this sort of coin. And I think Canada, we have an abundance of those critical and raw materials. We haven't done the same sort of job at extracting those materials and refining those materials. So I think where we are right now versus where we could be in the future on this issue, I think is very, very different. I think we could be a superpower on these issues if we choose to. The second part of that is that I think, and the neolithium example was just one clear example of that. We need to have a broader view of national security when it comes to our investments in critical and raw materials, not just focused on Canadian soil, but those involving Canadian intellectual property and companies, even if they're abroad.
Thank you, and perhaps I just ask Mr. Massey if he'd like to contribute to that as well.
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes. In order to limit the vulnerability of Canadian businesses is to invest in infrastructure. One of the reasons why there's so much mining activity in Canada, it's that these areas are remote, and one of the Chinese strategy is to invest in marine infrastructure when the country itself is underinvesting in its own sector. So if we were more generous, it would limit China's ability to we would be limiting the foreign investment of China in Canada, and we'd be able to export these natural resources, but also do part of the processing process here in Canada, which would create jobs.
Now, we have 10 minutes before the vote. We would have time for one more question from each side. If hands up, anybody has an additional question they'd like to ask? Mr. Chong?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Mr. Berkshire Miller. Many people believe that Beijing will invade Taiwan over the next 3 to 4 years. So if that happens, what do you think the U.S. response will be to that invasion? Will it be primarily a military response? Will it be a response similar to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? In other words, economic-based response? What will that response be, in your view? And what impact will that have on Canada?
I think that's a crucial question. I'll try to say it in as briefly as possible. I think, in the end of the day, it depends on what sort of contingency it is. So I think China has learned a lot of lessons from Russia's war in Ukraine. If we expect an armada of Chinese ships to show up and do a full-scale invasion of the main island of Taiwan, I don't think that's how the contingency is going to play out. I think they're going to work in the quote-unquote gray zone, take a couple of the islands around Taiwan before. And the reason I mention that is because that's premised on the idea they want to make it more difficult politically for the United States to make the decision to intervene. So I think a lot of it depends on the Chinese. If the Chinese, engage in a full-scale assault on the main island of Taiwan, I think that the United States, I don't want to say it has no choice, but I think it's going to be very, very likely that the U.S. engages. But if they pick off small islands like Kinmen Island or Penghu Island, it makes it a little bit more challenging for the United States to make that determination.
Thank you. Any other questions? Ms. McPherson.
No, all I wanted to say is I'm the deputy whip, and it's 5 to the vote,
Oh.
so I do have to go. The vote.
Well, then, why don't we say then thanks to our translators, clerk, analysts, technical staff, our support staff, and to our witnesses for their time this evening. We will conclude the meeting, and we will see you in 1 week. Meeting adjourned.